Valerie Bono from Proactive, and you're listening to the Building Bite podcast. Today's episode spotlights two guests from Liberty Mutual, Rachel Walsh, Regional Vice President of Northeast Claims, and Kristen Weber, Underwriting Officer for SDI. Tune in to hear their perspective on addressing key challenges and missed opportunities within SDI. For more information on this episode and others, check out The Building Bite at buildwithproactive.com. Welcome to the Building Bite podcast, a podcast for construction contractors, owners, and insurance professionals where you hear from experts on key topics to help you be successful. I'm Valerie Bono, one of the show's hosts and head of marketing and communications at Proactive. And I'm here with my co-host, Mike Diercksen, senior consultant of innovation and content solutions at Proactive. And our guests, we have two very special guests today. Rachel Walsh, Regional Vice President of Northeast Claims for Liberty Mutual, and Kristen Weber, Underwriting Officer for SDI, who is also with Liberty Mutual. How are you both doing today?
Doing well. Thank you, Valerie.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike, how about you?
I'm doing great. Just really excited. I had the pleasure of meeting Kristen at a conference a little while ago and setting all this up. So really excited to talk with both of these women today.
Yeah, so today's a really fascinating topic for our listeners, and it is addressing common challenges and missed opportunities within SDI. So Rachel and Kristen, as I said, we're very excited to have you on with us today and interviewing both of you, which is a really unique opportunity for our listeners to hear from two experts. This will be really informative. But before we get into our main topic, can you share with our listeners a little bit more about each of yourselves and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. I guess I'll start. I graduated from law school in 2007 and worked in private practice at a mid-sized firm in my hometown of New Orleans for close to 8 years. I was primarily a surety and construction lawyer, but the firm was retained by Zurich on a number of sub-guard matters, so I quickly became familiar with SDI. I then got the crazy idea to move up to the icy Northeast to take an in-house job with one of the firm's clients, Liberty Mutual Surety. My title was initially Home Office Counsel, but because of my experience with SDI, I was part of the team that stood up the SDI product, specifically the claims group and processes, when Liberty made the decision to start the new product line. I also had a large role in drafting the initial policy. Since that time, I've been promoted to Regional Vice President for Surety's Northeast region. So my role within the SDI team has been reduced, but I do still serve in a consultative capacity when there are questions, whether internally or from our customers, regarding the policy or issues that draw on my construction law background.
And I've had the privilege to work for some of E&R's top contractors throughout my career. I started my risk management career actually underwriting subcontractor for an organization's subcontractor default program. I've been blessed with the opportunity to continue growing within that organization and others holding senior risk management roles. I've really focused on coverage, claims avoidance and management, contracts, risk transfer. All along, though, I've been truly passionate about pre-qualification and subcontractor default insurance. With each organization, I've been able to see that their perspective and that not one size fits all.
Kristen, I know that you have a background from the GC side of things. So was there something that kind of drew you to the insurance side of the business, or what was it that attracted you to make that change?
Absolutely, Mike. I was drawn to the insurance side of the business for the fact that I knew I could bring a different perspective. Often underwriters have matured through insurance carriers and their underwriting programs, but have never actually been a part of a general contractor. So coming to the insurance side, I knew I'd be able to empathize with our insureds and could relate to the challenges that they face on a daily basis within their organization. That knowledge allows me to work towards a creative and equitable solution, not just for the insured, but also for Liberty Mutual.
Awesome. Yeah. Empathy is so important to understand exactly where these people are coming from, right? If you're dealing with a claim, it's already a difficult situation, or if even just underwriting process. Just knowing what they're going through and what they're looking for can make all the difference. So getting right into this there, with the conversation we have today, we discussed some potential challenges that often result in missed opportunities within SDI. And Kristen, I wonder if you could start us off with the first challenge or missed opportunity that you see a lot of.
Absolutely, Mike. A common challenge that a team faces when there's crisis is groupthink. We need to make sure that when those challenges arise and there is possibility for a claim, that we're all thinking clearly and critically. And first evaluating the potential for a default, this is a great time to engage the other internal resources so that you more objectively view the situation and discuss possible solutions. First off, are we actually able to default? What are the terms of our subcontract agreement? Are we in alignment with that? If we are able to, should we or should we be helping that sub across the finish line? These are key questions to ask. What are the next steps if we do default? How would you work through this situation if you didn't have a subcontractor default program in place? So you need to be able to take a step back, utilize those resources, ask those questions. All too often you get in this position and I have to act immediately. And sometimes we stop or forget to stop, take a deep breath and look at the whole scenario. It's easy for a project team to become victim to groupthink, especially during a trying time. Suddenly, every challenge on the job is the result of that one particular sub. Groupthink also leads to a false sense of confidence in regards to our documentation. As the general contractor, we've done everything right. Our documentation is perfect. Our schedule is right. And then all too often, you start to get into that claims process and you realize maybe your schedule hadn't been updated recently. The communications were lacking in structure. You didn't have complete records for timekeeping purposes, things of that nature. So you need to be objective about what is occurring on the project. And it's a great reason to bring in an additional internal resource that can support and manage that default while the rest of the team is able to focus on completing the job and meeting those next milestones that are there for them. When you go through a default, it must be documented as though you intend to legally pursue that subcontractor down the road.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kristen. It's easy to pin it all on something. There's someone in that instance. You want to make sure that you're thinking objectively, you're really analyzing the situation and acting accordingly, making sure, are we even following the proper procedures to do this? How would we handle that? So that's a challenge. And so in your opinion, then, if our listeners are listening to this, whether they're a GC, subcontractor, what is something that they could do to avoid groupthink and better position themselves?
So I think one of the next things is to go ahead and just sit down and actually create a schedule. What are the next steps? Who's involved in those next steps? By creating a schedule, you'll factor in all the requirements of the situation to keep the team moving forward appropriately. The plan of action, keep in mind, where are the location of the materials that maybe this defaulted subcontractor was responsible for? Have they been ordered? Are they in a warehouse? What steps do we need to take to go ahead and secure those materials and get them to the job site? Communication with those lower tiered subcontractors or suppliers. Again, have you guys been paid? Okay, are you behind in payments from the defaulted subcontractor? How do we get that cleared up and make sure that you retain those lower tier suppliers and subs to continue to make that job move forward with minimal impact? Another, again, brought it up a moment ago, but additional project management resources that are going to be required. Who do you need? How long do you need them? What capacity are you going to utilize those resources? You need to have a clear picture physically and as a narrative of all the work that is in place at the time of the default. I can't stress enough the importance of documentation when you get to an actual claim. Pictures speak 1,000 words, as we all know. So it's important to have that. Be meticulous in that documentation. Who was on site? What was the weather like? Make sure your superintendent is keeping notes as well. If there's rip and tear work that's the result of this defaulted subcontractor, how many workers were on that floor in a particular unit that day? What work were they putting in place? But at the end of the day, it truly is a schedule and a path forward, and being able to communicate that. You need to make sure that everybody is on the same page as you go forward.
Kristen, those are great points for our listeners. And we hear it so often. Communication is everything, right? Communication and coordination are absolutely huge, especially when dealing with a potential claim. So how do you make sure you are creating the most appropriate schedule?
think it's important that, again, you sit down with those resources and make sure everybody understands the timeline. Where are you in a project? What are the expectations for getting your first proof of loss submitted to your insurance carrier, making sure that you've communicated upwards as well for expectation on any potential recovery. So again, it all has to be part of a team, creating that schedule and setting realistic expectations as well. I mentioned it earlier. Know your policy too. What are the guidelines in there? What are the times that are actually within the policy in which the insurer has to respond also?
So, and Rachel, I specifically wanted to ask you as well. So within this and the importance of communications and coordination there, how do you make sure that everyone's speaking the same language? What does that look like for you?
Right. Communication and coordination are huge, and it's important that everyone is on the same page with regard not only to the schedule, but also to the parties' respective rights and obligations. The way that I think it's best to do that is to ensure familiarity and compliance with all of the contracts that govern the parties' relationship, including, of course, the governing SDI policy and the subcontract covered by that policy. And it's best that there's some level of familiarity before a claim arises. As a general principle, for example, SDI policies cover losses stemming from a covered subcontractor's default, but policies differ in their definition of default. Know how your policy defines that term so that you and the insurer are on the same page as to what is and is not covered. Also know what your subcontract and the law governing that subcontract consider to be a default, and if there are any boxes that need to be checked or dispute resolution procedures that must be exhausted before a subcontractor can be deemed to be in default or liable for damages. Know how your policy and subcontract define and treat damages or losses. SDI policies tend to speak in terms of direct and indirect costs, and subcontracts tend to use terms like consequential, special, or punitive damages. You should know if your subcontract waives any specific category of damages and how your policy treats damages. Indirect losses, for example, are typically covered, but they're likely subject to a sublimit or limited to some percentage of direct costs. And policies differ in their definitions of direct and indirect costs. If you have some clarity as to how these issues are treated going in, there should be very little confusion as to how different categories of damages will be treated when and if a claim is submitted, and clarity greatly reduces the likelihood of a coverage dispute. Policies differ in some other regards as well. It's implicit in all contracts, for example, that parties act in good faith, but a contractor needs to know what, if any, additional mitigation requirements its policy imposes. Policies vary, but by way of example, the Liberty policy generally requires that the insured take all reasonable and timely actions appropriate to preserve claims, causes of action, and rights of recovery against the subcontractor and any third party, and that the insured use reasonable measures to prevent and mitigate loss. Thus, the contractor needs to act in a manner that the law would consider to be reasonable in any given situation and ensure that its actions, whether by operation of law or its subcontract, don't somehow impair rights of recovery against the defaulted subcontractor. Most policies have language similar to that of the Liberty policy, but some may impose greater or lesser mitigation requirements. It's also very important to understand a policy's proof of claim requirements. You don't want to be caught in a lengthy process of submitting information to your insurer and having your insurer ask for further information either to substantiate or clarify the damages you're seeking. And I can speak for Liberty when I say that we don't want to be in a position where we feel like we're wasting our customers' time or distracting the customer from the management of what's likely a tough project by asking for more and more information. Know, for example, if your policy or subcontract require a CPM schedule and what you need to provide in terms of baseline schedules or schedule updates. Some policies are extremely explicit in terms of what's required, but most are far less specific. In either event, it's best to know the answers to these questions before a claim arises, not after, so that you not only ensure that you possess the proper documentation and can recover the full value of your claim, but also that the required documentation is submitted initially and not after a lengthy back and forth with your insurer. I can only speak for Liberty here, But we know that policy interpretation and submitting a proof of claim can be complicated, sometimes really annoying. Many of our insureds have highly skilled risk management departments and need little assistance, but the Liberty SDI team is always available to act as a resource and provide clarification. We want to be transparent. We desire open and honest communication, and we strive for clarity. We want for you to think of us as a partner, and we don't like secrets or surprises. So we do what we can to ensure that the parties enter into the insured-insurer relationship knowing exactly what to expect.
I love that. And, I think you got to read what you're buying, right? You have to know the policy. And it seems like something that you shouldn't have to explain, but we've all scrolled through the updates on our phones and clicked, I accept all terms and go with it. So it's definitely very important to communicate effectively, but also, as you said, understand what it is that you have and make sure you're applying the appropriate resources there. So this has been excellent. I mean, as we're going through, we've broken down our problem. We've identified some issues as far as policy language, how that is such a crucial component, right, to the process. And we're establishing a schedule, making sure everyone's on the same page, how to move forward through this process together. What would come next?
And I think the most important thing is just realizing what resources are available to you. There are experts out there, both internally and externally, through your broker, your carrier, and then your organization that specialize in these types of issues. So don't be afraid to reach out, utilize those resources, ask a bunch of questions. I'll tag on to what Rachel said. You need to know what's in the policy, know what you're supposed to be responsible for, and that way you can be prepared when you are at that point of making a submission. You don't want to be going back after the fact and trying to recreate the wheel and recreate the documentation that you need to be able to be made whole on your claim.
And just to add to what Kristen said, at Liberty, the surety claims team is at the disposal of our SDI accounts. We have lawyers, construction accountants, and highly skilled engineers who mitigate defaults and other on-site issues, complete projects, and creatively solve the business and financial issues of our troubled accounts on a daily basis. There's no requirement in the SDI policy that our insured seek our counsel when dealing with a defaulted subcontractor, but we do hope to be thought of as a resource. We routinely solve problems before they become major issues and would strongly advise that you consult with us at the first sign of trouble. We can not only walk you through the claims process, but also provide practical advice.
Yeah, that practical advice, Rachel, is so important, and I know it's valued. So that leaves us with our last step, and that's probably one of the most critical steps. Can you share with our listeners what that step is, and what are some of the do's and don'ts around that step?
Yeah, so I wanted to raise the issue of subrogation, which is typically thought of as the last step. But because when an insured is dealing with a subcontractor who has defaulted and the ramifications of that default, the primary focus tends to be getting the project back on track, as it should be. No one's thinking about some far-off concept of subrogation. I'm here to tell you that the concept should be at the forefront of your mind, only because you have to be sure that your actions don't somehow impair your SDI carrier's rights to recover its losses from the at-fault party at the end of the day. You have to remember that once you submit a claim to your carrier and the insurer makes a payment, your claim against the defaulted subcontractor, at least to the extent of that payment, belongs to the insurer, and you no longer have the right to limit or waive the defaulted subcontractor's liability for that loss. If you somehow limit the subcontractor's contractual responsibility for the loss, you potentially limit or waive coverage. This is a non-exclusive list solely for illustration purposes, but that might happen if you fail to comply with the contractual dispute procedure set forth in your subcontract and somehow limit the right to recovery. If you contractually waive some element of damages that you seek from the insurer, if you release a claim against the subcontractor as part of a settlement agreement or otherwise, or if you issue a deductive change order to the subcontractor, removing some scope of work, in that case, you'll almost certainly waive coverage for damages relating to that scope. Keep in mind that there may be an instance where you think it makes sense to settle with a subcontractor, or where you believe that the issuance of a deductive change order has the potential to mitigate damages stemming from a default. If you believe that to be the case, you really need to bring your insured to the table and discuss your rationale. Try to get the insurer's input and ultimately consent. Without that consent, you have to assume that your actions will impact or waive coverage.
It's important to read the policy, right? It's such a crucial component of just knowing what's going on and being collaborative, working with your carrier to understand exactly what the situation is and making sure you are not setting yourself up for failure by making a decision you thought was right at the time, but if you had maybe read a little more thoroughly or consulted with your carrier, could have been avoided altogether. Kristen, specifically to you, where do you see people struggling the most with these challenges?
I see the biggest challenge is just in the communication and coordination. The default scenario is stressful to begin with, and you see one or two team members acting as though they're on an island and bearing full responsibility to get to the end. These situations require everyone to take ownership, to know what part they do play, and work in conjunction with others. With this, you didn't get there all by yourself, and you're not going to get to the end successfully all by yourself. Again, utilize those resources, make sure you're engaging team members and communicating expectations all the way around. And that's internally and externally.
Rachel, and how about you? How does that compare on the claim side?
Yeah, I don't see it a lot, but some people do seem to struggle because there's a notion out there that once SDI coverage is on the table, all losses are covered and the subcontract and its remedies are of less importance. That the default can be remedied, costs submitted to the insurer, and the loss fully recouped. While we are here to indemnify our insureds for losses, that indemnification is subject not only to the terms of the SDI policy, but it's also governed by the insured's right of recovery against the subcontractor. I'd strongly advise that those insured by SDI not lose sight of the subcontract and remain cognizant of the need to dot the T's and dot the I's, not the T's, and cross the T's imposed by that subcontract.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And so I want to thank you both. It's been such a fantastic conversation. We're starting to get towards the end of that discussion. But one thing we like to do on the show is always leave our audience with an action item, something that they could, after listening today, maybe start to implement either whether it's today or tomorrow, right? Moving in the right direction to make sure they're setting themselves up for success. So I would ask you both, what do you think would be that next step, that action item for them?
I would go with knowing your resources. It's crucial to know exactly what resources are at your disposal. That could be the difference between a smooth recovery or a challenging one. Be objective when you assess the situation and the possible path to resolution. And again, just engage those resources.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, keep in mind both your resources and those of your insurer. We believe ourselves to be your partner and hope to serve in a consultative role where you allow it.
Rachel, Kristen, that's excellent. So we love to give our audience 3 takeaways. So with regards to these challenges and missed opportunities, what would your 3 takeaways be? And Kristen, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Again, just be objective. Assess the situation and your path to resolution. I would tell you to identify your resources. Don't hesitate to engage with those resources. Again, the broker, your carrier, internal. And develop a clear path forward as a team. Nobody is responsible solely on their own.
And I would suggest that the listeners think about the long-term consequences of their actions as they handle defaults. As you formulate a plan, be ready to pivot where necessary. It's important to identify risks early and come up with alternative plans so that you're informed when forced to make tough and hopefully timely decisions.
Excellent. Yeah. Begin with the end in mind, right? Understand how it's going to go out from beginning to end. So I want to thank you both for coming on the show today. As you may have noticed, this is a Building Bite. That's BIM Insurance Technology with the experts. You are our experts. Now, I know you're both in different areas of the country, so we're excited to ask this question, but what are you taking a bite out of today? Start with Kristen.
All right. Well, it's Valentine's Day. I'm in Texas and there's barbecue. So I think it's going to have to be some Part 8 barbecue for me today.
Rachel, what about you?
Yeah, I'm in Philly until next week when I get to head back down south for Mardi Gras. And my car currently has a sheet of ice on it that I'm not super enthused about moving. So I think that it may be a DoorDash delivery bite-in sort of day.
You can never go wrong with that. So we thank you so much for being on the show. It's a pleasure speaking with both you, Rachel and Kristen, and having you share some insights about what's going on with Liberty Mutual and the marketplace. If our listeners want to hook up with either of you, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, the easiest way to contact me is probably email rachel.walsh@libertymutual.com, but I can also be reached on LinkedIn.
And much like Rachel, you can find me on LinkedIn or email kristen.weber@libertymutual.com.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Building Bite. This podcast has been brought to you by Proactive. Check us out on thebuildingbite.com, where you can subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media for all future The Building Bite news and updates. You can also find us on your favorite apps, including Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Amazon. If you have ideas for episode topics that we should cover on the show, or you know somebody who would be a perfect guest, let us know at connect@thebuildingbite.com.